All right, we're moving into the skeletal system, and we'll be starting with the tissue and cells of the skeleton. And that's what we have here on this initial image. We're seeing a view, a sample of a small developing segment of bone tissue. And we'll see that there's different types of bone tissue as well. So it's this orange fragment that we see here, this small developing spicule, and we'll talk about cell types specific to the skeletal system. So taking a look at the list of functions for the skeleton, we want to think of all the bones, the joints, the ligament structures, making our entire skeletal system. And it's the basic support structure for our entire body. So the frame and shape of our internal skeleton gives the basic frame to the human body. And the other 10 organ systems are contained and protected within or attached on, superficial to the bones. We'll see that there's various elements that are deposited within the skeleton. And a chief principal one, of course, is calcium. And we'll see that there's two types of bone marrow stored inside of the skeleton. There's the yellow bone marrow, which is truly adipose tissue, so for energy storage. And red bone marrow, this is the type of bone marrow used principally, it's the major site for the creation of our blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. And of course, with the strength of our bone tissue, the hard, rigid bones, rich in calcium, this gives the protective feature, of course. So our rigid bones protecting our delicate organs. And then when we move into the section on the muscular system of our body, skeletal muscles, they contract, and for the most part, they're pulling directly on our bones to allow us to move. So starting with the makeup of bone tissue, I've already mentioned, of course, the importance of calcium, and we'll get a percentage for that. The calcium portion is found in many different forms, but a principal one are these hard, rigid, yet brittle calcium crystals known as hydroxyapatite. And the molecular formula here is just for reference, just to see how rich it is in calcium. We don't have to worry about the entire formula. So this is what accounts for the rigid strength of our bone tissue. So making the bone strong and rigid, of course, giving that protective feature to the deeper internal organs such as your brain, your heart, your lungs. However, there is some degree of flexibility in the bone tissue, and this is afforded by the connective tissue collagen fibers. So having this blending of both the strong calcium deposits, yet some degree of flexibility from the collagen fibers, this is truly what makes up this unique tissue and properties of bone. It's rigid. However, the collagen helps to resist the ease of breakage, of fractures. And that's the case. Our bones will bend slightly before we fracture and break the calcium. Calcium alone is quite brittle, and then collagen, of course, now decreases that potential for fracturing. And we have this figure here. It's not from the textbook, but we want to take a look at these items here. In terms of the composition of bone, again, we see a large percentage coming from the calcium deposits, accounting for the strength, as well as another major contributing factor from the collagen, affording the flexibility. Whereas now this second box over here, what we want to take away is the amount in bone as percentage of the total amount in the body. So what this is kind of saying in a convoluted way is 99% of the calcium that's in our body is found just in our bones. So the bones are a huge reservoir and storage site for nearly all of our body's calcium. And of course, calcium's vital for bone growth and development. but it's also, as we'll see soon, key for other organs, other tissues, other systems. So it's not just stored in the skeleton, but it also, at the appropriate times, will be released and freed from the skeleton. And what we're seeing here, just a quick figure to point out that, yes, there is living tissue within bones, and for that reason, bones have an extensive blood supply. So all the various cells, structures within. And this is something that, well, we wouldn't see, of course, when we study the models of the bones. The models that we have of the bones and the real human bones as well in the classroom are truly just the calcium remains, but all that living tissue that once needed a blood supply is missing from those, again, remains of the skeleton. And here's a quick little experiment I did at home. I just took a chicken wing and, of course, getting down to the bone. And this bone was soaked in acid. So this bone here was treated with acid. And over the course of several days, just soaking in acid, this now breaks down the calcium deposits within the bone. And you're seeing how extremely flexible it is. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. But the effect of acid on the bone, eroding, breaking down calcium, and you saw how flexible it became. So of course, within connective tissues, there's unique types of cells, and bone is one of the many types of connective tissues. In fact, for that reason, the connective tissue stem cell, known as a mesenchymal cell or mesenchyme. So in the environment of a developing bone structure, the mesenchyme cells will differentiate. They'll develop into what's called a osteoprogenitor. And anytime we see that prefix, just simply os, os, or osteo, these pertain to bone. So os or osteo means bone. So now this osteoprogenitor cell can now only give rise to distinct bone cells. So in the next step of development, osteoprogenitors differentiate into now what's called an osteoblast. So this is now a bone producing cell. And the root of the term here, blast implies that it is a young, highly active cell. So it's a young form of a cell, immature would be another name. And it's highly active. So in this case, an osteoblast is actively producing and secreting this fluid. And as that fluid surrounds the cells and solidifies, it's now building this rigid bone tissue. So if we make a little sketch of an osteoblast, it's secreting what's called osteoid, and it's surrounding itself. As this osteoid now solidifies and it's enriched with calcium to make it much more rigid and strong. There's the development of fibroblasts and collagen, so building that bone matrix ultimately. So now over time, when osteoblasts mature, the name is now osteocyte. And that's what the root term now cyte is. This is now the mature form, the older form of a cell. So osteoblasts mature over time to become osteocytes. And with older age, they are less active. So osteocytes do still produce bone matrix, but at a much slower rate than they did earlier in their lifespan. So that's exactly what we have now. A former osteoblast that's completely surrounding itself in its own matrix, its own surrounding material. And that goes right back to this little sketch here. So now once the osteoblast is completely encapsulated, it's now known as this mature osteocyte, and it's trapped or embedded in its own matrix. For connective tissue, the term matrix just means all the extracellular material, everything surrounding the cell. So we see here, in this case, these are ultimately giving rise to the bone developing cells. So the ones that add more and more bone matrix to enlarge and build bones. Another very different type of cell is now known as osteoclast. So we have to imagine following just a different pathway of development, starting with mesenchyme and ultimately giving rise to osteoclast. Osteoclast is not directly related to the development of osteoblast or osteocyte, but a very different developmental pathway will lead to osteoclasts. And osteoclasts, we see here, produce a combination of acids from their lysosome. And with the secretion of a combination of acids, well, we already pointed out earlier, acid is a way to actually break down and erode bone tissue to, there it is, release calcium. So that's stored calcium within the bones. We said that 99% storage rate of calcium in our bodies in the bones. This natural type of cell that we have, and there's a need for these to produce acids. And this is a way to release calcium from the skeleton. It could circulate to the blood, and from there, it could be used for many different functions. Our muscles need calcium, so do our nerves, of course, many other structures and tissues. So with that in mind, we have these cells, the young active osteoblasts that we can produce, versus now the osteoclasts that are now breaking down the skeleton. These two are now working against one another to regulate how much calcium is being stored in the bone, as well as regulating how much calcium is circulating in our blood. So we need a balance between the activity of these two cells, which of course are stimulated by changes of hormone levels. So now we want to move on. As we see here, there's different structural forms of bone tissue. So we have what's called compact or just simply dense bone. And the major difference is the increased density of bone matrix. It's not completely solid. There are numerous canals and cavities within. Whereas, in contrast, what's known as spongy bone, and it gets the name because it truly looks like a sponge, like a natural sea sponge or artificial, dishwashing sponge. So the density is much lower. So there's a lot of open space. There's just many, many numerous hollow gaps within the tissue, much more than compact bone. So if we look at any bone of the body, just the femur, for example, the bones will have a combination of both types of compact and spongy bone formations. They're made of the same composition. So going right back to the previous slides, the calcium for strength, the collagen for the flexibility, the resistance to fracture, the same types of cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts present in both compact and spongy bone. And a principal difference here beyond the density is spongy bone is found in a deeper internal location. We find compact bone towards the surface. And just a visual of that here. We have chapter 5, this figure here. And yeah, this happens to be a femur. So we can see deeper inside, as we just mentioned, and enlarged here in magnification, where you see just the network of little struts, but there's a lot of open space. That's the appearance of trabeculae, the spongy bone structure. whereas closer to the surface, where it's more solid and dense, that would be out here. This is the area of the superficial compact bone. If we follow the step from here to here, and then that's this figure here. And again, you can see there's multiple canals for all the blood vessels, the nerves, the cells, the osteocytes, of course, spanning throughout this area. So we'll take a look at these two structural forms in more detail. We'll see them under the microscope for lab. And to start with compact bone, the basic structure that forms compact bone are the multiple osteons. And a single osteon appears as a cylinder. We'll just highlight one here, for example, this already sectioned open. So multiple osteons that are closely packed together. That's what makes the basic structure of compact bone. However, there are three general types of layering that come all together to form compact bone. And we'll start with the term here, lamellae. That's exactly what they mean. The word lamellae means layers. So in this case, it's the layers of bone matrix, the layers of bone growth. And we'll start with this one here. The osteon itself is made of multiple concentric lamellae. So that's what we're seeing here. Each of these circular layers that ultimately form one osteon. So I always think of the appearance of a tree stump, how you get the rings of growth on a tree stump. That would be the same principal idea for the concentric lamellae that come together to build one osteon. So now compact bone is composed of multiple osteons, and filling in the spaces between osteons, the layering of bone matrix between osteons, that's what's described as the interstitial lamellae. So they'll take on whatever shapes necessary to fill in gaps between osteons. And then lastly, at the superficial surface of the compact bone, that's where we find the circumferential lamellae. So it's truly all three types of lamellae ultimately to form compact bone. The most common, the principal one, of course, the concentric lamellae that build the osteons. So now moving on to spongy bone. We are, of course, you notice deeper into the bone structure to see that location. And the repeating unit that ultimately forms spongy bone are each of these little struts known as trabeculae. So these smaller little fragments and shards of bone that ultimately interconnect to make the entire network of spongy bone. The principal difference, of course, is it's a much lower density of bone matrix, making it much lighter. And another benefit, of course, is all of the hollow cavities within the spongy bone. This is now a principal space to find our two types of bone marrow, whether it be adipose tissue, our yellow bone marrow, is truly just fat cells, lipid storage, as well as the red bone marrow to develop blood cells. So we see surrounding the trabeculae, filling the spaces within spongy bone, we have the two types of marrow. A third benefit, it's lightweight. It stores the marrow, both types. And a third benefit is now having the branching arrangement, a kind of lattice network of spongy bone. It helps us now to distribute the load and force that's put on a bone. So the spot on a bone where the load is most severe, where most force is put onto a bone, that's where we're going to find a high proportion of spongy bone. And with the struts or trabeculae, that'll help to now evenly distribute that force across the entire surface of the bone. And to understand what we're looking at here, you have to imagine the pelvis would be located here. So all the weight of our torso coming down to our pelvis, that's coming right down here onto the head of the femur. But now we want to help to distribute that force all throughout this entire area of the epiphysis. And spongy bone allows for that. So we see those three benefits. So if we just take a look now, kind of reviewing what we just discussed, we have this bone here. This is actually a tibia that's in a coronal plane. We're able to see the superficial, more dense, compact bone. Deeper in, and you notice for a tibia, really concentrated at the two ends, especially, known as an epiphysis. That's the ends of a bone. That's where we find this higher percentage of spongy bone, where the most force is being put onto it. Our knee joint would be here, our ankle joint down here. So where we're transferring force from bone to bone, where that force is severe, we have the spongy bone located. Filling in the gaps, of course, there would be bone marrow, and especially for long bones, what's known as a marrow cavity, that's a major site for bone marrow, especially that yellow bone marrow. So moving forward, we see that now surrounding the compact bone at the surface, there's this layer of tissue, this external area known as periosteum, and lining on the hollow surface of the marrow cavity and lining the trabeculae of spongy bone, the internal lining known as endosteum. And that's where we'll pick up now with these two. So there is the superficial external periosteum, and we'll see this prefix many, many times. Peri meaning around, in this case, around the surface of the bone, and osseous, bone tissue. So periosteum is a rather thick, dual-layered membrane of connective tissue that's wrapping around the external surface of compact bone. So it's tightly bonded and held onto the surface and follows every curve and contour, hence the analogy right here, tight-fitting bond right on the surface of the bone. However, the exception is periosteum is not found at the joint surfaces. Instead, we'll see another type of tissue capping the surface of the bones at the joint surfaces. And there's a few bones that completely lack periosteum, and we'll point out that exception. Whereas now on the internal surface, and as we just mentioned, lining the trabeculae, the fragments of spongy bone, as well as lining that large hollow medullary cavity, the very thin, delicate internal membrane, this is known as endosteum. And again, the prefix endo, internal, deep, we'll see these prefixes all the way up until the final exam. So we want to become accustomed to those. So now in terms of what types of cells do we find in these areas? We notice here labeled in the periosteum, a cellular layer. This is where we develop our bone producing, our bone building cells. And that would be the young, active osteoblasts. And they do their job of producing and secreting bone matrix and building up the surface of the bone. Whereas the internal spaces, and we'll just point out here, there's the large hollow spaces and the hollow gaps in spongy bone. And to help hollow out the internal surface of the bone, that's where we find the acid producing, the bone tissue degrading osteoclasts. And that allows us to hollow out the bone and release calcium from the internal surface. So of the various bones that are in our body, and since we're studying principally adults, you'll hear the average value. The typical person has 206 bones as an adult. And of those 206, there's what we're going to stick with are the 6 classical groups based on shape. And we have just examples listed here. So long bones, these are found in our appendages, the arms and legs, and just examples. The general shape of a long bone, there's a narrow midsection, and then on 2 ends, it's enlarged. So just think of the generic dog toy, the like dog chew toy. That's the basic shape of any long bone. It doesn't mean that it has to be a certain length. It's just narrow in the center, enlarged on the 2 ends. Short bones, these roughly kind of boxy cube-shaped bones, are only located at the wrist, the carpus, and at the ankle, the tarsus. The only examples of short bones. Flat bones implying that they're thin, so ribs are a great example. The roof of the skull, the sternum, all good examples of a thin, flat bone. I'll skip down to here, what's known as a suture bone. Suture bones are now small little fragments of bone tissue that now fill in spaces between the major bones of the cranium. So these would fit in between, say, parietal and occipital bones if necessary to completely bond the adult skull together. And I'll go to a figure of this, of course. Sesamoid bones, we see here an exception, bones that lack that external periosteum. And a good example of that is our kneecap, the patella. So with these first 5 groups seen here, truly if a bone doesn't fit into these other 5 groups, then they're just called the irregular bones. And some examples would be some bones in our face, bones of our spine are some examples. And that's what we see here, this figure 511. So a long bone, this is what I sketched out earlier. There's a narrow section, the epiphysis, enlarged on the 2 ends, and the narrow portion called diaphysis. The carpals are the tarsals, so the short bones, just roughly the boxy cube-shaped bones. A flat bone, of course, is showing how thin it is. Again, of course, the deeper spongy bone. And then at the surface of the bone, external, internal surfaces, there's the compact bone. A sesamoid bone, such as the kneecap here. An irregular bone, again, does not fit into the other 5 categories. And what irregular bones tend to have are a number of different kind of projections, protrusions that extend outwards. That tends to be one common description to them. And a suture bone, as we see here, we're looking at a skull. The joints between the major skull bones are known as sutures. And there's some degree of suture bone that bonds these larger cranial bones together, kind of like a puzzle piece you see here, just filling in any little gaps. And there can be, it depends on person to person, there can be some larger size suture bones as necessary, again, to completely bond and fill in gaps between those major cranial bones. So of these various bones that we're born with, of course, there is an increased number earlier in life. So at birth, a baby has 300 bones. we just brought up the value here for the typical adult. And a reason for the decrease, one example is many bones actually bond and fuse together. And an example to give you would be the sternum, the breastbone. There's one specific superior portion of the sternum. There's a midsection of the sternum, and then the inferior tip. We'll learn these in lab. But these three separate bones of an embryo ultimately bond together at adulthood to become one sternum. So multiple bones will fuse to become one larger bone, and that's one reason why the number decreases. So how many bones do you actually have in your body? Well, you could take a look at this equation here. So unless you have some extra fingers, how many sesamoid bones do you have? We almost likely develop some on the inferior soles of our feet just due to standing up, and on your skull, it would really be unknown until you're possibly dissected. So the typical person, a composite person, we always say has around 206 bones. So of these bones of the body, moving forward, we now see that there's now these two different processes to develop and create bone. So what we could call bone development, or the more specific term, ossification. These two different mechanisms of developing bone structures for our body. So we'll explain the meaning of each of these terms. So starting with the word ossification, this has a very specific meaning. Ossification, this means the replacement of some original connective tissue by true bone tissue. So we'll say in a first phase, and this first step or this first phase, this occurs in the embryonic stages. There's the creation of some non-bone connective tissue. So some type of connective tissue forms, but it's not actual bone, osseous connective tissue. So we'll say there's a formation of non-bone connective tissue. And now in a second phase, moving into our fetal stages, and this will continue after birth as well. So a little later in time, this original non-bone connective tissue will be broken down. So we'll just copy that over. This original tissue will be broken down, and truly the term ossification means the original tissue will be replaced by the growth of true bone tissue. So we'll say replacement with actual true bone tissue. And that's how each of these processes form. There's some original non-bone, so is it collagen based? Is it cartilage based? Some type of connective tissue forms first. That makes the basic shape. You can think the molding and shape of that future bone. And then this tissue will be broken down and replaced with the growth of actual bone tissue, spongy bone, compact bone tissue. So in both of these mechanisms, it has that replacement step. So how they're different now, intramembranous ossification. In intramembranous ossification, the original tissue to form is a collagen-based material. So it's a collagen-rich material. And then it's replaced by the creation of true bone tissue. Whereas endochondral ossification, as part of the name here, there's the formation of cartilage. So cartilage is the original embryonic non-bone tissue. And then over time, that cartilage is broken down and replaced by actual bone tissue. So let's take a look at each of these. Intramembranous ossification, as we see here. In this image here, taken from an embryo with its developing skull, there's first just this collagen membrane that's developing. So you want to think of the dermis of the skin, just a collagen-based structure. And now our bone-producing cells migrate to that area. Osteoblasts begin to secrete bone matrix. And where there once was only this collagen membrane, we now build bone tissue in that location. So this is an illustration showing intramembranous ossification. Endochondral, the cartilage type of growth, we'll skip ahead quickly. That's this diagram here. In the first phase, there's truly just the formation of cartilage. And then as development continues, the cartilage represented here in blue is broken down and degraded and is being replaced, is being ossified by the growth of bone tissue, here illustrated in the tan color. So we'll go into each of these in a little more detail. So intramembranous ossification, the original tissue is a collagen-based connective tissue. And then in later phases is now going to be ossified, building bone in that area. So we have the description. There's first the development, of course, our collagen-based connective tissue. And I gave the example, like the dermis of the skin, that dermal type of development. And then as we continue the developmental process, this dermal collagen-based material is then replaced by bone growth, spongy and compact bone growth. This mechanism of ossification forms the clavicle, any of our sesamoid bones, the patella being one of them, and the majority of the skull. So most of the skull forms this way, meaning the larger percentage of our skeleton is forming by the cartilage mechanism of bone growth. As these bones, of course, continue to grow and enlarge, the term oppositional growth applies, of course, to these bones, or every bone of the body, I should say. And what's meant by oppositional growth, this is a mechanism that increases, you notice, the width of the bone. So the bones get wider and thicker. And every bone in our body, no matter which mechanism it grows by, all the bones in our body undergo this widthwise expansion. And this is a result of osteoblasts, which are depositing bone right along the surface of the bone and expanding the surface, expanding the width of the bone. And as an example, that's this figure here. We happen to be looking at a bone in the arm, the humerus, but again, all bones undergo this oppositional growth. And if we take a look at this cross section, very early in life, this infant has a certain amount of width to their humerus. And with the osteoblast depositing bone along the surface, expanding out the surface and thus expanding the width And with more deposits on the surface over time into adulthood, still expanding the width of the bone. So that was coming from the osteoblast, depositing bone right along the surface, right within the layer of the periosteum. But we also want to point out at the same time, we had our osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, the bone cells that release acid, eroding bone tissue, you notice here. And this leads to the hollowing out and enlargement of that marrow cavity as well. So it's a great illustration. We're breaking down calcium from the inner surface of the bone, and then now it could be redistributed to the external surface of the bone. And here's just a figure showing the intramembranous ossification process, ultimately giving rise to these small spicules, which would enlarge to trabeculae, ultimately to produce, over time, spongy bone. And we can see all the surrounding undeveloped mesenchyme. So now moving into the cartilage type of development, the endochondral ossification. That's what we see again, starting with this cartilage model. So the cartilage formation, that original non-bone connective tissue. And using this example of a developing femur, over time, moving in through the fetal stages, more and more of that calcium is degraded. It's ossified, it's being replaced with the bone growth. And by the time we're born, we still have these prominent sections of hyaline cartilage that's still within the bone structure. However, these epiphyseal plates are temporary. They're commonly called growth plates, but they are temporary pads of cartilage that remain until the end of puberty. And then there's hopefully what should be permanent cartilage at the ends, and this is known as articular cartilage. And this is the exception here. The joint surfaces are not covered in periosteum. Instead, they're covered in articular cartilage. So let's discuss this now in a little more detail. The endochondral ossification, the cartilage type of development, and now we're seeing specifically it is hyaline cartilage. So that's the exact type of cartilage just used for endochondral ossification. So originally starting out as a embryonic structure, the femur develops from first hyaline cartilage, and then continue to develop. That hyaline cartilage is broken down and it's being ossified. It's being replaced with the development of true bone tissue, compact and spongy bone forming. So the majority of our skeleton forms this way. This is just a simple kind of description. Most of the bones inferior to the clavicle. Of course, don't forget about your kneecaps. So a larger percentage of the bones of our skeleton form from this hyaline cartilage development. All of the bones in our body build up their external surface, depositing bone to the surface, making them thicker and wider. But now we have this term called interstitial growth, and this is now greatly going to affect the length of the bones, how long they grow. And this lengthening here of the bones is directly tied to that structure we just pointed out called an epiphyseal plate, or that growth plate commonly called. So as long as we have this temporary hyaline cartilage epiphyseal plate in our skeleton, we do have the potential to greatly and continue lengthening our bones. So ultimately, you could think of this epiphyseal plate here This allows for the increased lengthening, interstitial growth of your bones. And the longer your bones and your legs are, the longer the bones, of course, of your spine. That's greatly going to impact your height or how tall you become. So we'll continue from here and we'll really take a close look at those epiphyseal plates. So again, the general description for endochondral ossification is in the first phase. This is now describing the development of hyaline cartilage. So with our connective tissue stem cells, once again, mesenchyme. In this case, developing a young cartilage-producing cell, chondroblasts. They mature, they surround themselves in the chondrin, the cartilage matrix. They're now chondrocytes encapsulated in lacunae, and we've created the hyaline cartilage structure. This is the original tissue in the first phase. So now the second step, this is truly the bone growth, the ossification. So we see that original tissue of cartilage ultimately dies off as it's broken down. We deliver our bone producing cells, osteoblasts, and they do their job of producing bone matrix. So step 2 is truly the ossification, the true bone tissue growth, but it takes place in the molding of that original pre-existing tissue. So that's truly showing what ossification means. And we're seeing it here visually. So to go through it, again, starting with the completely hyaline cartilage, we now know specifically hyaline cartilage is formed. Building up a thin shell of bone on the surface. It's known as a periosteum collar. Ultimately, that starts the process of the calcification and the death of the chondrocytes. Once the chondrocyte cells die, that's when blood vessels can start to penetrate deeper in. Cartilage, of course, is typically avascular, but once the cartilage cells die off, blood vessels can penetrate into that, so delivering more bone-producing cells. We're building the bone structure here that continues along the two edges of the bone. That's what leaves us with this temporary plate of cartilage between these two separate areas. And this is the appearance of the bone at birth. So with that epiphyseal plate, we could continue to lengthen the bones as we get taller and bigger. Ultimately, these epiphyseal plates begin to thin out and thin out. And once the epiphyseal plate is completely ossified, you can see now that remnant of an epiphyseal plate, or another name for that is now epiphyseal line. This is once the epiphyseal plate has been completely ossified, is known as an epiphyseal line. And now we lose that potential for any more interstitial growth, for any more lengthening. Yet we do have, you notice here, the articular cartilage. This is truly the area of the bone that just had never been ossified. So let's see the details for that. So at birth, we're born and we have that epiphyseal plate. So it's found on each side of the bone. Here, of course, we're looking at a long bone, the femur. And for any long bone, the narrow shaft section, one name for it is diaphysis, the long slender portion. And at the edge of the epiphysis, right where it meets the diaphysis, that's where we would find on each side an epiphyseal plate. Starting out early in life, the epiphyseal plates are quite thick and, of course, made of hyaline cartilage. And this is the exact spot where the bones are able to lengthen. So our long bones can increase their length right at that area of the growth plate, at the epiphyseal plate. And this is done by adding bone deposits on each side of the diaphysis. So we could add bone to the diaphysis to make the diaphysis longer on this side. And we could add bone deposits on this side of the diaphysis to lengthen the bone in the opposite direction. So the bone is growing into the cartilage. The bone is ossifying the cartilage. So we have here an x-ray. We're taking a look at, you notice here, the knee joint. We're looking at the popliteal region here, the back of the knee. So we have the femur from a child. The x-ray is highlighting the bone structure. And what appears as the black line is the epiphyseal plate, the sign that this must be an x-ray from a child. So to truly describe how the bones lengthen is what we'll see here. So on the shaft side of the epiphyseal plate, so meaning right here, closer to the diaphysis, osteoblasts are doing their job of producing bone matrix, ossifying into the cartilage, so lengthening the shaft by adding more bone as it grows in this direction. So again, we're replacing that cartilage with new bone. We're ossifying and making the shaft longer as it penetrates into the epiphyseal plate. But now on the opposite end of the bone, the opposite end of that growth plate is known as an epiphysis. So that's this whole enlarged area here. And it's right on this area, and I'll change colors to make it a little easier to understand. So right in this area, we're actually adding more cartilage to the growth plate. So we're expanding the growth plate in this direction. I'm trying to point downwards. And what's key is this growth of cartilage on the opposite side of the epiphyseal plate, it's occurring at the same speed in which we're losing cartilage on the opposite side, closer to the shaft. So the takeaway is, early in life, a little child, they're losing cartilage on one side of the growth plate as the diaphysis is lengthening, but they're also developing more cartilage on the opposite side to expand the growth plate. So the overall goal is a little kid can make their bone longer, but they're going to retain their growth plate size. And here I am just adding in the arrows to show that. So on the side closer to the shaft, one side of the growth plate is being ossified. So the blue arrow showing how there is loss of epiphyseal cartilage that allows the shaft to lengthen. But on the opposite side of the growth plate, closer to the epiphysis, there's the development of new cartilage. So the result is, again, the diaphysis grows longer, but the epiphyseal plates stay nice and thick. And this allows for continued growth later in life. So a 5-year-old is undergoing both of these processes. They're making the bones longer as they grow, but they're also keeping a prominent growth plate for future growth. So say at age 10, they could still grow. And this would be the simple analogy. This runner here is representing the rate of bone growth. This runner is representing the growth of new cartilage. If these are running at the same speed, they're going to maintain their distance, thus maintaining the thickness of the growth plate. So now the major changes at puberty, with the changing levels of hormones, of course, one major effect is the growth of cartilage production is going to be decreased. So starting at puberty, this cartilage production slows down. The bone growth now could start to catch up and close the distance. So at puberty, the growth plates start to thin out. And the thinning of the growth plates, that is a sign of puberty. So as this continues, of course, over time, with the decrease in cartilage production, the bone growth is going to catch up and catch up and catch up, and then ultimately completely ossify the entire growth plate. And once that occurs, the skeleton is now showing a sign of maturity. And now we're left with what's called an epiphyseal line. And you notice here on this x-ray, you no longer see that black line within the bone. Instead, this prominent white line, that's showing the feature of an epiphyseal line, the loss of a growth plate. And without a growth plate, we lose that ability for interstitial growth. We can't get any taller. So a good example is at age 40, you're not going to suddenly grow taller because you no longer have a growth plate. And then, of course, finally, the remnant of endochondral ossification. We started as an embryo with the production of the hyaline cartilage. Most of the bone was ossified. Near the end of puberty, that's when the epiphyseal plates are completely ossified. However, the articular cartilage, it's not that articular cartilage is capping the ends of the bones. This is simply the area that was never ossified to begin with. So hopefully we want to keep that protective pad of cartilage at the ends of the bones. And this is found between our bones, protecting our joint surfaces. So just a few more x-rays. We can see here epiphyseal cartilage labeled, and we're looking at an x-ray of the wrist here. These would be the carpals. We can see the area of the radius and ulna. And you notice the prominent epiphyseal plates. Whereas here, labeled epiphyseal lines, this would be the wrist from an adult. And you can see that white line I'm trying to highlight here. All these arrows pointing to epiphyseal lines. So this must be an adult x-ray versus here, a juvenile x-ray. To finish up this chapter now, chapter 5, we'll take a look at some dietary regulations, hormones that affect bone growth. So starting here at the top, this makes sense. We spent a lot of time talking about the importance of calcium for strength. Well, calcium needs to be, of course, in our diet to supply that element for our bone growth and development. In order to properly absorb adequate levels of calcium from our diet, vitamin D aids in the absorption of calcium. So those two go hand in hand. Whereas now these vitamins here, especially vitamin C, this is important for the development of course, collagen. So we see from the material that we eat, it makes those two contributing factors for our bone tissue, calcium, and especially vitamin C for collagen. Activity, physical activity, just standing up, walking around, that's also helpful in our bone growth and development. So you always think of exercising your muscles, but your muscles are directly pulling right on your bones. So that helps to strengthen and develop our bone structures as well. So now getting into the hormones, seeing the effect of the endocrine system influencing multiple systems of our body. We're going to see how these two hormones, especially here, parathyroid and calcitonin, are really working against one another. So we'll start to describe this. Parathyroid hormone. This hormone here, of course, one of its effects is from our intestines. It increases the absorption of calcium from our intestines, drawing it into the bloodstream. And that's ultimately the goal. From the foods that we eat, if we could absorb more calcium from the intestines, absorb it into our bloodstream, parathyroid hormone will increase the calcium levels that's in our blood. And now that circulating calcium can be used for a number of purposes. But also another way to do that is if we increase the activity of osteoclasts, so we got to think back to that. Osteoclasts secrete acids. The acid breaks down the skeleton, and that calcium could be freed up to enter the bloodstream. So truly two different ways to increase blood calcium. The effect of parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is now the opposite. So let's just write that. Calcitonin is going to decrease the concentrations of calcium that's in the blood. And how is that performed? To lower blood calcium levels. Calcium that's circulating in our blood could be flushed out via the kidneys and released with our urine. So we're removing calcium from the bloodstream, thus lowering blood calcium levels. Or if we slow down the function of osteoclast activity, more of that bone, more of the calcium remains in our bones, less calcium ends up in our blood. So we see these two hormones have a direct opposing function. Whereas there's numerous hormones that help to stimulate bone growth. And that's what we want to describe here. So there's multiple hormones to help us build bigger, larger, stronger, denser bones. And calcitonin here in particular. Calcitonin by decreasing osteoclast activity. If we slow down the osteoclast activity, it's easier now for osteoblasts to build up bone density because we're not breaking it down as rapidly. However, right here, the necessary hormone and the necessary cell type, osteoclast, this is a way to break down bone tissue to release calcium. So, of course, their levels, of course, getting out of control could lead to, it's called osteopenia, everyone experiences. And in severe cases, it's called osteoporosis, where there's large amounts of bone density loss. We'll finish up this chapter now by taking a look at fractures, breaks to the bone. We're not worried with the actual steps here in healing after a break, but the types of breaks. So what's known as a compound fracture, this is when the bone fractures to the point the bone shifts out of its natural alignment and the bone now will damage the skin. So the bone has to break in some fashion to the point where it damages and tears through the skin. That's called a compound fracture. Whereas a simple fracture, the bone could break in any way, but there's no injury to our skin. A simple or a closed fracture is described as. So now we'll move on to specific types of breaks, and we're only going to take a look at a few examples. You have these images at the end of chapter 5, and we're only going to focus on the ones that are in the box. So what's called a comminuted fracture. This is when the bone breaks and it Ruptures, there's multiple little shards, little fragments. So a ruptured, fragmented bone, that's a comminuted fracture. So you can imagine in order to repair this type of injury, the major big fragments of bones would have to be literally bolted together. Titanium metal really bonds well to our bone tissue, and a physician would use that and an external appliance to piece the larger fragments together so that it could be held together and then bonded and healed from that comminuted fracture. A spiral fracture, this occurs when the bone is twisted, so there's some rotation, twisting, and that pressure then leads to the fracture, the break of the bone. So that spiral twisting type of fracture. Green stick fracture, again, we're only focused on the ones on the box. It results ultimately with this small superficial crack. The underlying reason behind this is more common in young children. And young children have more flexible, softer bones. So due to the bending of these softer bones, that can now lead to this superficial crack, this green stick fracture. The term itself, green stick, applies to a young tree. The softer, flexible tree trunk, and if it bends, it can have those fractures. And that's where this name comes from. An epiphyseal fracture, you can imagine this be a very severe case. This is where a fracture occurs, again, in a young person. And the fracture would occur right at that area, right near the epiphyseal plate. So the complication here is when this has to be treated in a way that allows for that continued interstitial lengthening growth of the bone. If not treated properly, that person could lose the potential for any further lengthening. So if this occurred, imagine, say, in a 9-year-old, and it's not properly treated, that limb, that appendage, may be stunted in its growth, in its length. A compression fracture, so this applies to the vertebrae, and it's truly just a crushing, a smashing of the vertebral bodies, to use the term. We'll learn that in lab. So a crushing, a smashing of the vertebrae when compressed from force. So a few different examples of specific types of bone fractures. When the force is so severe, it goes beyond the strength of the calcium deposits. There is that flexibility of the collagen, but when the force is simply too strong, that leads to the breakage of the bones.